the old Final Fantasy VI cart, pop it in, and play it right from the get-go. You can't do that with the original World of Warcraft now, and I think that's kind of sad. So several of you mentioned this idea. That was something that many of you had a very difficult time saying goodbye to, and I agree with that 100%. Even though I never got into WoW, it was never my thing, I totally get why many of you would have a very difficult time saying goodbye. By the way, guys, I could have gone back and mentioned every single game that all of you said because they were so good and so many. I had to just pick some because, folks, I try not to make these videos 2 hours long, okay? Marky's talked about Final Fantasy X, and I think that's a good example of a Final Fantasy, although certainly not the only one that was discussed here this week on the Weekly Wringer. I think that Final Fantasy X is, of the contemporary ones, of the more modern Final Fantasies, you know, you would be hard-pressed to find one that is more immersive. Go through the criteria. You know, speaking to the human condition, more immersive, you know, those kinds of things, than Final Fantasy X. It's I don't want to call it a masterpiece, it's not my favorite, but I think of the contemporary games it is the best, and I think there are several reasons why, but rather than go into all of those reasons, what I will say is I support the idea that Final Fantasy X is a tough game to say goodbye to. It had a lot of cool elements to it that I think made the characters very easy to align with, which has been something that's been very badly missing in my estimation from recent Final Fantasy games. It's difficult for us, and maybe this is a very biased opinion for an American audience, but as an American, it's difficult for me to kind of really identify with some of the characters out there that are very crazy. It blows up my suspension of disbelief, which has been really difficult for me to do, and that's one of the reasons why I can't get into Final Fantasy past 10. So I think that's a good selection by Marquis. Smoke Pants followed up from the question from last week and talked about Chrono Trigger, and this is one that should be obvious. I'm not going to talk more about Chrono Trigger. If you want to see me talk a lot about Chrono Trigger, you can absolutely go back and watch last week's video. But in any case, Chrono Trigger is absolutely one of those one of those games that's really hard to say goodbye to. With all the elements of time, with all the things that you go through, you become very enamored with the characters and you become kind of one of them, and that is exactly the kind of immersion and the kind of story and the kind of elements that go into a game that make it so wonderfully warm and welcoming, that keep you there and keep you wanting to come back. Sonic Rose talked about Okami, and I think this is, you know, I think this is a dark horse out there. Okami is awesome. It's one of those games that comes along that doesn't really play to the rules that came for games before it. It really is a kind of step forward, and I think it's a shame that games that do kind of make that leap every once in a while don't really get rewarded with a ton of sales, because they kind of change the way people think about video games, and oftentimes that's uncomfortable, right? But Okami is engrossing in every sense of the word. It is immersive. It is fun. It is, you become, it's not even as much as a character, you become a part of the world because you're helping to create the world. That's a theme that runs out through a lot of the games that you guys mentioned, but if you being a part of the creation process makes it harder to say goodbye in the end. And so I think Okami is a great example of a game that makes you involved in the process and therefore very difficult to say goodbye to. Man with a Harmonica talked about Rayman Origins, and here's an interesting, the reason I put this on here, guys, is because Man with a Harmonica talks about it for a completely different set of reasons. You know, first of all, I love the creator of Rayman, Michel Ancel, is an awesome game designer who's created, among many classics, including Rayman, also Beyond Good and Evil, which is one of my favorite games. But Rayman Origins, and really a lot of the Rayman games, kind of bucks a lot of the trends of the video game industry as well, and it does so in a way that is kind of irreverent. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It doesn't go too ridiculously deep. it just kind of, thumbs its nose at the rest of the community out there. It just kind of laughs at everybody else and at itself. And in doing so, I think it creates a kind of, there's kind of a solidarity with the audience that plays Rayman, that you're just kind of in on the joke. And that makes a game very hard to say goodbye to. When you feel like you are a part of it because you're in on it, you understand it, it speaks to you culturally. And that's why I included Rayman Origins, which is one that probably many of you never would have put on the list. But I thought it was a good selection. And this is a perfect example of where the why from the question is what got it included. Because if you just said to me Rayman, I would have been like, no way, no. But I love the explanation, and I thought it was, the idea that it kind of isn't all the things that that I laid out for you here in many ways as criteria. The fact that it isn't those, but that is what makes it endearing, and that's what makes it fun, and that's what keeps you coming back and making it hard to say goodbye. That is a huge, huge part of it, and I think that's what kind of put us over the edge for mentioning today. The Male White Mage talked about Minecraft Classic specifically for a couple reasons, but this is the example par excellence of a game where you create the universe, and therefore it's very hard to say goodbye to it. I have even recently gone back and picked up some of the maps that I created in Minecraft many, many moons ago. And I remember the stories of them, right? It's crazy. It's unbelievable. It's almost like you jump back into a world where you go, oh, yeah, I remember this. There's a history here, right? I think it's one of the reasons why Minecraft, in terms of survival, is so, so good. If you play Minecraft as an adventure in survival rather than in creative, and you build something, you might not be able to build on the kind of grandiose scale that you do in a lot of games, in a lot of creative games. But there's a story involved. I'll give you an example. And this is exactly what the kind of thing the Male White Mage was talking about. Even though he's only talking really about Classic, I'm talking about the entire concept of Minecraft. I remember building a castle one time. I just loaded it up, just this morning. And I remember, I was like, oh yeah, I remember this. This is the very first castle I ever built. And I decided I was just going to go build a castle. And I get up on the top of one of my towers and I look down. It's never completed. Things totally wide open, snow's coming down, it's crazy. I look over, and there's this like giant spire, and underneath it there's like a little mound with a door on it. And I remember that when I found this site, the first thing I did was find something kind of right beside the site that I could plow into, make a tiny little hut home out of while I was building, to stay safe, while I was building the walls of the castle. And there's a story there. Right? There's a story. It might be stupid, small. Maybe some of you are sitting there going, you freaking idiot, Commodore. This is just the stupidest thing I've ever heard that's so stupid and insignificant. Well, maybe it is. But you know what? It gave me a little bit of a narrative that makes that world really hard to say goodbye to. I've got all kinds of awesome things going on in Minecraft and other maps now that are bigger and nicer, and I have certainly learned a lot of techniques since then. But the world at that moment that I created has a history to it, and when something has a history to it, it's just too good to say goodbye to in many ways, and I think that really jumps out at me. Siska 83, another one of our new members, mentioned something that is near and dear to my own heart. Counter-Strike 1.6, CS 1.6. So for those of you that are of the appropriate age, you played hours and hours and hours of this game. I have played hours and hours and hours of this game before 1.6. I have played hours and hours and hours of this game after 1.6, and Counter-Strike is just fun. Folks, you might not see this as a great, wonderful accomplishment, because I could probably do the same thing from reading books, but I will tell you almost everything I know about contemporary weaponry comes from my understanding of Counter-Strike. It's a game that was in a day where FPSs were dominated by just really blowing things up, destroying things, and killing as many things as possible. Counter-Strike came along as a game that emphasized accuracy toward reality, accuracy toward tactics, and strategy above blowing things away. And I thought, But by the way, also celebrated very highly refined skills, of which I never had any, right? I was always awful. Just ask my brothers, they used to just annihilate me all the time. But it was still fun, and it was a hard thing to say goodbye to. And I remember when they moved to Source, it was exactly the same game, but they moved to Source, there was this huge revolt of people that still wanted to stay on 1.6. And I think when you have something like that that happens, it means that people are just very, very afraid to say goodbye to an old game. So that's why I had to include it. I had to include it. Troy Loza Tomata talked about Final Fantasy VII. If I was going to go for a number 2 on the list of the contemporary 3D Final Fantasies, after 10 would be 7. Do I really need to say why? Final Fantasy VII changed the game of video games. It changed the entire face of video gaming all over the world. There's no question that it did. It was one of the biggest games, if not the biggest, in the PlayStation era. And it really is what took Sony from a fringe player and made them what they became. And hopefully what they will stay, although their current offerings certainly make me ask if and how and why. But Final Fantasy VII is such a deeply immersive experience, and it's before things got so crazy with Final Fantasy VIII and beyond that it got so nuts and out of control. It was before all this that it was still good. It was expansive but not ludicrous, and the freedom that you had in the game combined with the real empathy you had for the characters. To me, that was just huge, and a big part of why I love that game. So Final Fantasy VII is a really hard game to say goodbye to. The example that was provided, as a matter of fact, was the idea of being ready to beat the game, knowing you could do it easily, but just kind of waiting a little, doing a couple other things, having some fun, doing stuff elsewhere, just because you could, because you're like, I don't want this to end right now. I'm kind of happy the way things are, and I don't want to go blow it all up yet. Done that in many a game, so I totally am there with you. That is the mark of a game that we don't like to say goodbye to. The Beer Ninja mentioned Mass Effect, which I think you could put on par with a lot of more of the American RPG that is very much a contemporary phenomenon. The idea of the kind of immersive RPG a la Knights of the Old Republic, Elder Scrolls, some of the newer Elder Scrolls games, and Fallout, for example. These are all, Fallout 3, I think these are all part of the same kind of argument. They're all such great immersive worlds. And if you're a sci-fi fan, there's probably no greater universe out there for a video game, besides potentially Halo, then Mass Effect. Mass Effect is a sci-fi game for sci-fi fans, and if that's your thing, then I think it's going to be hard to kind of say goodbye to any of that. So I agree 100%. And here's the name I can never get right. So Windows Sun 91 or Windows On 91, I don't know. Clarify in the comments this week, please. Talked about Ocarina of Time, Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and I think this is a great one. For me, A Link to the Past is on my list, but I think Ocarina of Time probably is even better, because it was the first time I really found myself lost in a 3D world in a good way, where it wasn't annoying, it wasn't awful, it was fun, it was immersive, and everything was cool. And you wanted to continue to discover, and you wanted to continue to find other things. You didn't want it to end. That is the mark of a game that you can't say goodbye to, and I 100% totally agree with that. So, in any case, that is, I think you could have easily said any of the Zelda games, and many of you said things like Majora's Mask, and what have you, Wind Waker, so on and so forth. I think you probably could have claimed this for a lot of them. It just goes to show the genius that goes into the creation of the Link games, which I think is awesome. But I have to say that that any of them are good, but I think Ocarina of Time would probably be my selection as well for the game that was hardest to say goodbye to and move on to the next one. So there were so many more to talk about. You know, Shenmue. You know, there was so many